She climbed to the top of a smoking pile of wood chips, scooped up a handful with her bare hands, closed her eyes, and smiled. Her neighbors thought she'd lost her mind. What she was actually building would end up saving every farm around her. Grace Whitfield was 26 years old, and what she inherited wasn't really land. It was silence. 41 acres in the hill country of eastern Kentucky, the kind of place where morning fog pools in the low ground like it's alive. And the old barn leans a little further every winter that passes. Her grandfather had worked that dirt his whole life. Grace had only ever visited in summers, sneaking barefoot through his garden rows as a kid. When he died, the farm came to her. Tired, eroded, quiet in that specific way only forgotten land gets quiet. She didn't sell it. She didn't lease it out to some stranger who'd spray it back to life with chemicals. She packed a bag, grabbed a battered green notebook, pulled on a pair of boots that used to be her grandfather's, and she moved in with more questions than she had answers for. The dirt told her everything if she was willing to listen. Pasture packed so hard from years of cattle that water just ran off it. Topsoil the color of weak instant coffee, maybe 2 inches deep where it should have been 8. Harvests that had shrunk every single year for a decade before her grandfather finally stopped planting altogether. This land didn't need a season off. It needed to be rebuilt from the ground up, and Grace had absolutely no idea where to start. That's when Walter Briggs showed up at the end of her driveway. Walter was 58, and he ran the small family sawmill about 3 miles down the hollow. Every week, his blades chewed through fresh-cut oak and hickory and maple, and every week they left behind a mountain of chips and sawdust that nobody in the county wanted. Hauling it off had gotten expensive. The dump fees kept climbing every quarter. He'd heard through the grapevine that Grace had an empty pasture doing nothing at all. Just temporary, he told her, turning his cap over and over in his hands like he was nervous. I know it's an eyesore. I'll figure something else out soon as I can. Grace looked past him at the pile already growing behind his truck bed. She didn't say anything right away. That was her way. She listened a beat longer than most people found comfortable. Bring more, she finally said. Walter blinked. More? If you've got it to spare, she said. He didn't get it. Nobody in the valley got it. But he wasn't about to argue with free disposal. So the trucks kept rolling up that gravel drive week after week. By the second month, the pasture that used to sit empty now held 4 steaming mounds of wood chips, each one taller than Grace's own pickup truck. Kids on the school bus pressed their faces to the glass and gave the farm a new nickname, Chip Mountain. Her nearest neighbor, a cattleman named Tom Riley, leaned on the fence one evening and hollered over, half joking, "Grace, you building the county's biggest compost heap, or did you finally crack?" She just smiled and kept her notebook open, jotting down the internal temperature of the nearest pile. 131 degrees, steam rising at first light, 3 feet down at the center, almost too hot to touch. She didn't know exactly what she was building yet, but she knew what she was watching. Heat, moisture, time. Something alive was working underneath that surface, and she needed someone who could tell her what it meant. Margaret Ellis lived alone on a hillside a few miles over, 74 years old, with 4 decades of soil science behind her, and 0 patience left for people who weren't genuinely curious. She'd clocked Grace at the farmer's market weeks earlier, asking the extension agent questions nobody else bothered to ask. She'd noticed the notebook, too. "May I see that?" Margaret asked one afternoon, nodding at the worn cover. Grace handed it over without a word. Margaret flipped through pages of temperature logs, rainfall notes, rough little sketches of mushrooms pushing up through the chips. "You're not just storing waste out there," she said. "You're watching decomposition happen in real time." "I don't fully know what I'm watching," Grace admitted. "I just know something's happening. It gets hot, then it cools, then things start growing on top of it." Margaret didn't explain. She never did, not directly. Instead, she asked a question. Why does a forest floor build rich, dark soil every single year without a single bag of fertilizer? Grace thought about the woods behind her grandfather's barn, the soft black dirt under the old oaks, the layers of leaves turning into something richer with every fall. "Because it's always breaking down," she said slowly. "Something in there is eating it." "Now you're close," Margaret said. "What do you think feeds on wood?" Grace didn't have an answer that day, but she went home and started paying real attention to the white threads spreading just beneath the surface of her piles, fine as spider silk, branching through the chips like a hidden map nobody else could see. She sketched them in her notebook, white fungal threads, growing fastest in the shaded, damp corners of the pile. She had found mycelium, the hidden network fungi use to break wood down into something the earth can actually use. She didn't have the vocabulary for it yet, but she knew it was doing something important. The failures came first. They always do. Her first attempt at turning those chips into real compost fell apart within weeks. One pile got packed too tight, went anaerobic, and turned into a stench that pushed her back 20 feet just standing near it. Another pile got spread too thin, dried out completely under the summer sun, the fungal threads shriveling up before they could finish their work. She wrote every failure down without a shred of shame. Pile 2, too compacted, no oxygen reaching the center. Smell sour, not earthy, fungi dead. Pile 4, too dry, mycelium gone by day 12, needs shade and steady moisture. When she brought those pages to Margaret, the older woman only asked, "What happens to a fallen log in full sun compared to one buried under leaf litter?" Grace realized the exposed log would sit there hard as stone for years. The buried one would crumble into soil within a single season. Moisture, shade, air, balance. Every failure was just the forest teaching her rules it already knew by heart. She learned that wood chips are loaded with carbon but starved for nitrogen, and that without the right ratio, decomposition either stalls out completely or turns sour instead of sweet. So she started mixing in old hay, coffee grounds from the diner in town, manure from Tom's cattle, chasing the same balance the forest hits without anyone measuring a single thing. Her first finished batch, spread across a corner of the worn-out vegetable bed, barely made a difference. The carrots came in thin. The greens came in pale and weak. She wrote it down anyway. Not enough yet. Try again. Nearly a full year passed that way, turning piles by hand, checking moisture with her bare fingers, counting earthworms by flashlight after every evening rain. The neighbors still called it Chip Mountain. The kids still laughed from the bus window. Grace never once argued with any of it. She just kept measuring. Then one October morning, she knelt at the edge of the field where she'd spread her second finished batch 6 weeks earlier. The soil wasn't gray-brown like the rest of the pasture anymore. It was dark, almost black, crumbling soft between her fingers. She dug 6 inches down and found earthworms everywhere, more than she'd ever counted in her life. She sat back on her heels and, for the first time in a year, let herself actually believe it. Field 3, she wrote. Soil texture completely transformed, dark, crumbly, holding moisture overnight after rain. 14 earthworms in one shovel scoop, highest count yet. She had done it, not with luck, with patience. The following summer came in bone dry, the kind of dry that cracked open the cattle pastures and turned every neighboring garden to dust by the middle of July. Tom's fields browned out early. His cattle grew thin, grazing on crisp, dead grass. But Grace's restored soil held water like a sponge. Her vegetable beds kept producing straight through the heat wave. The young fruit trees she'd planted the spring before never showed a single day of stress, their roots wrapped in soil that had finally relearned how to hold on to life. Tom stood at the fence line one evening, staring at her green rows against his own brittle brown pasture. He wasn't joking this time. "Could you help me rebuild one of my fields?" he asked quietly. "However long it takes." Grace nodded. She didn't need to say another word. Walter Briggs came by not long after, half expecting that after nearly 2 years, Grace would finally ask him to stop bringing chips or maybe send him a bill for the mess still sitting on her land. Instead, she asked if the mill could start separating the chips by species. "Oak breaks down slower than maple," she explained. "If I know what's coming each week, I can plan my piles better, match the right wood to the right project." Walter just stood there a moment, quiet. He'd spent 2 years paying to get rid of something he figured was garbage. Now the woman receiving it was asking for it to be sorted, like it actually mattered, like it was worth something. Because it was. Word moved slow through that valley, the way it always does in farm country, not through advertising, but through fields that started looking different than they used to. Local farms began asking for Grace's compost. The county extension office came out to study her soil data and filled up notebooks of their own. A small elementary school arranged a field trip so kids could touch, with their own hands, what actually healthy dirt feels like. What had once been called Chip Mountain slowly turned into something else. Grace never chose the new name. It just happened. People started calling it Whitfield Soil Works. It grew the way real things grow, slowly. A few bags sold at the farmer's market, then a standing order from the garden center in town, then orchard mulch for 3 different farms, living soil blends for raised bed gardeners, and a small, steady list of customers who trusted her because they'd watched her work through 2 winters before she ever sold them a single thing. She never called it a business, not at first. She called it paying attention and sharing what worked. Years later, the farm is almost unrecognizable. Where those steaming piles of discarded wood chips once stood, there are now thriving gardens, healthy young orchards, and fields of rich black soil that hold moisture through droughts that used to break the whole valley. Butterflies drift through wildflowers along the fence lines. Birds nest in trees that didn't exist when her grandfather was still alive. The creek along the property edge runs a little clearer than it used to, its eroded banks finally softened by roots strong enough to hold the ground together. Grace still carries the same notebook. It's nearly full now, the cover worn pale at the corners from years spent out in the field. The wood chips were never really waste. They were unfinished forests, just waiting for someone patient enough to understand what they wanted to become. Sometimes the greatest harvest starts long before anyone plants a single seed. Sometimes it starts with the exact thing everyone else is trying to throw away.